U.S. President Donald Trump's national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, is traveling to Paris on Monday for a three-day trip to meet with European officials to discuss China and other foreign policy issues. O'Brien and Matthew Pottinger, the Deputy National Security Advisor, are visiting France for a meeting with O'Brien's counterparts from the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy. Though the European Union is slowly allowing more international visitors, it is still blocking Americans from visiting the EU countries, citing the U.S. failure to contain the spread of coronavirus. How will the U.S. and its European counterparts deal with issues related to geopolitics? Could the U.S. allies fall in line with Washington on global issues despite prominent differences? Let's loop in our panelists. In Gettysburg, we are joined by Klaus Lauritz, professor from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's originally coming from Germany. And in Washington, D.C., John Citilidis, principal at Trilogy Advisors, LLC. There's a lot to be said and to be discussed, I guess, with the National Security Advisor and Deputy National Security Advisor's trip to France to meet with their European counterparts. So, Professor Lauritz, you're originally from Germany. Tell me about what's likely to be the atmosphere of this discussion, given the latest events.
American-German, American-European relations have been rather strained in the recent past. However, the atmosphere will, of course, be very friendly. That is the way these meetings are being handled. And both sides, the United States and the European partners, are, of course, interested in re-establishing good relations. And I think in the United States, it is recognized how important the European allies still are. While President Trump doesn't seem to be thinking of NATO as an important organization, he has announced to withdraw troops from Germany. He doesn't seem to appreciate the airbase, the American airbase and other bases in Germany. But this is largely not shared by Trump's foreign policy advisors. So both Pottinger and O'Brien will make quite an effort to be very nice, very persuasive, and try to really re-establish good relations with the United States and with the Europeans. And if I may say that, I think there will be two major points which will be on the agenda. The first point is, which will be covered by O'Brien, to re-establish relations and to talk about issues such as NATO, Russia, Afghanistan, and related issues, maybe also the coronavirus issue and the travel ban on both sides. And secondly, I think Pottinger will deal with China and to obtain a common line, a common transatlantic line on how to deal with China, on how to approach the recent problems with China.
Mr. Citilidis, sitting in Washington, tell me more about how would Washington, particularly these two national security advisors, would be able to overcome two things. One, the COVID-19 pandemic situation in the United States, which would make it really quite different from the other countries, and therefore making traveling very different from how the other countries are dealing with one another. Second is you're having an election coming November. Before that, nobody knows exactly what's going to be the political and geopolitical choices for years to come. So at this point, will this talk necessarily bring any result?
Well, on the COVID issue, I think it's very important to note that we don't have a uniform situation throughout the United States, and actually most of the country has fared relatively well over the last several months. The core problems were in states such as New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, where you have fatality rates that are equal to or exceed those of Italy, of Spain, of the United Kingdom. On the presidential polling, you raise a very important issue. We're 4 months away from the elections, but the polls were very, very wrong in 2016. I think it's easy to see how the polls are going to be very wrong this time around, and they're not very helpful in July.
Mr. Lauritz, the allies are the allies, but at the same time, things are changing. So how is Europe, whether divided or collectively, looking at the changes transatlantic relations? You illustrate some points of it, but it seems that there are more than just the 2 points.
Yeah, the Europeans are very hopeful that the November elections will lead to the election of Joe Biden as the American president. There's a universal dislike of Trump, both of his person and his vulgar expressions, and above all of his politics. And these politics have really not taken the close relationship with the allies into consideration at all. You know, he has imposed tariffs on the Europeans on steel and aluminium, for example. He has threatened tariffs on the car industry. He has been very skeptical about NATO. He even was about to withdraw from NATO. All these things are not appreciated at all in Germany and in Europe. However, on the other hand, the United States is, of course, still the only superpower in the world. Other countries such as China are coming up rapidly, but it is clear that the United States is still the most important country for the time being, at least for the Europeans. So re-establishing relations is highly important. But the Europeans are very afraid that they are not united in foreign policy issues, neither regarding relations with America, but also not regarding relations with China. And I think one of the reasons why O'Brien and Pottinger are coming to Europe is to bring a more united policy towards China back into the alliance.
Yeah.
As you know, Italy has signed the Silk Road, the new Silk Road project, which has been very much criticized by the other European countries. So, for example, that already brings countries apart from each other. The Germans are very dependent on exports to China and are tending to be in the middle between the United States and China. And that is, of course, something which the United States doesn't want to tolerate. And then perhaps lastly, the UK is also in the middle between the United States and China, for example, regarding 5G and Huawei, and what to do about Huawei, to ban Huawei or not to ban Huawei. And I think O'Brien will be there to urge the British to of course, take a tough line towards Huawei.
We see the U.S. also trying to withdraw from international institutions, which the Europeans seem to subscribe to, and also from international cooperations, which the Europeans, with the European Union, which really is a crystallization of collaboration and working together spirit. So, Mr. Stylianides, ideologically speaking, particularly on the global stage, how far do you think the two are shifting from one another? Is it still could be mended? Do you think the next leader who comes into the office could really do that after already 4 years of quite a dramatic change?
Well, I really don't know how dramatic the change has been. There are some countries, as the professor correctly notes, where the governments are at odds with the Trump administration, especially in Germany, occasionally in France. But I also see that you have in the United Kingdom a conservative prime minister who's very much in line with President Trump on many issues.
If I could remind you, the UK is withdrawing from the EU, just for a footnote.
But it's still a very important country in NATO, and it's still a European power, and many Eastern European countries are very happy to be siding with the United States, led by countries such as Poland and Hungary, very concerned about the Russian security threat to the continent. So there's no pan-European orthodox perspective. There are different perspectives based on geography, economics, and culture. But I think what's happening right now is that the Trump administration is building a bipartisan consensus in Washington that there has to be a new strategy for dealing with China, given what Washington sees as very aggressive behavior by China in Asia, in Europe, and worldwide. And as the professor correctly notes, Huawei is going to be at the core of that strategy. We already see probably that London is going to begin a multi-year phase-out of Huawei from its 3G and 4G systems and be banned from the UK going forward. France is considering a multi-year phase-out, and Germany has Deutsche Telekom, which has very close ties to Huawei, so that may be a little bit of a different direction. But the largest strategy was made clear by Robert O'Brien at a speech in Arizona a few weeks ago, the FBI director last week, and I think you'll see Secretary of State Pompeo and also the Justice Department head, the Attorney General William Barr, also laying out very important critiques of China. And this is going to be a growing sentiment in Washington, Republicans and Democrats alike.
Mr. Laris, about that, will the European capitals kowtow to Washington's demands, or the European capitals, even though they're very different from one another, are likely to come up with their own approach, no matter what it is, toward China?
Yeah, that is, of course, a big question of the future and the big questions which will be discussed in France. I think the Europeans don't know themselves. They don't want to take sides. You know, take the Germans, for example. They, of course, want to maintain their close security relationship via NATO with the United States. Also, the American market is highly important for German exports. But as we all know, the Chinese market is also highly important to German, particularly to German car makers.
Right.
So to take sides is almost impossible for the well-being of the German nation. And any chancellor, be it Angela Merkel or any future chancellor, any future successor, will try to avoid having to take sides. This requires a really cautious balancing act by any German politician between the two superpowers, and that is essentially also the dilemma many other countries in Europe find themselves. I fully agree that the UK is, of course, led by a conservative prime minister who is somewhat close to Trump, certainly closer than Angela Merkel is, but also he will need the Chinese market. Also, he will be dependent on good political relations with China. So Johnson doesn't want to move too close to Trump either. On the other hand, of course, he doesn't want to move too close to Beijing. And that is a big dilemma. And I think so far, no solution has been found how to overcome that dilemma of being wedged between the two huge powers in the world.
Right.
And the Europeans simply are still discussing that among themselves, and I don't think any solution has come up. There certainly has so far not developed a kind of united European stance towards either China or the United States.
Mr. Stylianides, going to Washington by the two national security advisors, besides accusations and criticism against China, what else can they offer to their European counterparts? What kind of vision, potential interests, and benefits can Washington these days still offer to the big European capitals?
Well, the European Union is still the single largest trading partner of the United States, and that trade and commercial relationship is critical, as is the security relationship. And even where President Trump has talked about moving 9,000 or so troops out of Germany, they're not all leaving Europe. They'll be repositioned in Eastern Europe to deal with the Russian threat, and many of those will likely be repositioned to Asia to deal with what's seen as a growing China threat. But I think it's very important to note that none of these European countries will, as you put it earlier, kowtow. I mean, they'll make their own independent sovereign decisions about what they feel is in their best interests economically, politically, and security-wise. And I also think it's important to note about the other, that there was a bipartisan consensus in the United States for decades to improve relations with China, dating back to the 1980s until China joined the WTO 20 years ago. But the sense is that China perhaps has taken advantage of its position in ways that are now detrimental to the United States. And that's why you see this game-changing strategy in Washington in recent years. And for countries like the United Kingdom, along with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they're in the Five Eyes intelligence network where they get the highest level intelligence sharing from the United States. And the fear is, because of the national security law that Beijing passed, that the Chinese Communist Party passed, that forces Huawei, if Beijing asks, the party asks, they have to surrender data, that this is a backdoor into the telecommunications networks and infrastructure grids of some of the most advanced industrial countries in the world. If Beijing had not passed that law in 2017, you may have seen a very different response from the U.S. and the West towards the Chinese Communist Party and the whole 5G question.
I see. One of the questions really is whether the accusations are based on facts, and there are concrete facts or not. For example, the accusations against TikTok, which is now a company based in the United States when it's operating in the United States, and a company based in Europe when it's operating in Europe. Now, we noticed that the French president, Mr. Macron, after the U.S. threatened to ban TikTok in the United States, in fact, sent his first message on TikTok to appeal to his young audience in his country and in Europe. This is just one of those interesting developments on the sidelines as we see the nuances are evolving between the United States and Europe regarding their policies and attitudes toward China. So, Mr. Laris, when the Europeans notice the very strong strategic points that China and the United States are looking at each other, are the Europeans smart enough to hedge? And what way they should hedge for their biggest benefit? That is an interesting question. It's similar to earlier question, but still different.
We all know that countries, including often, not always, but often Russia and China, do pursue disinformation campaigns, that also industrial espionage is being conducted by many nations in the world, including Europeans, but also by, for example, Russia and China. So it is understandable that developed industrial countries like the ones in Europe, but also the United States, are particularly careful about trying to avoid that. And they are suspicious regarding Huawei and TikTok and other things. Whether that is really justified, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientific advisor in these questions. I can't judge. But I think I would like to add one thing, that is, when I travel in China, I'm often asked, when will the Europeans give up on the United States? And I think this is an illusion, which is particularly widespread in China. I do not think that the European-American relationship, despite all the current strains, is actually going to break. The Europeans have to balance both sides. But that dilemma, or to be in the middle and make really both sides happy without selling your soul to either side and kowtowing, as you called it, which the Europeans do not want to do. They don't want to sell their soul. And the new European Commission President von der Leyen, a German, as you know, has emphasized that the European Union wants to become more active in geopolitics, wants to find its own path in geopolitical relations. This is, of course, an ambition which many European Commissions have had in the past, and it never has really happened. But the new EU Commission is very ambitious, is very targeted on that goal. And so I think perhaps the European Union will develop something which is a more independent role in international affairs, but that doesn't mean they will move very close to the Chinese orbit, or they will totally leave the American orbit.
Yeah. Mr. Stylianides, I'm just going to ask quite a simple question. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel were being spied on by Germany's American counterpart. Now, how much trust do you think really is there left or to be nurtured between United States and Germany, and in the larger sense, United States and some of the major European capitals?
I think that caused a problem in relations between Berlin and Washington. I don't know to what extent Mr. Trump's ambassador there, Richard Grenell, who was quite a very outspoken and blunt diplomat, also caused unnecessary harm to the relationship. But I think in many ways, as the professor notes, the bedrock interests of both Germany and the United States are still very much on a similar path, similar adherence to democratic processes, to security, to trade, and even the best of friends. And yes, we have had problems, there has been friction, and there's no guarantee that a Biden presidency would foster closer relations with Germany. But the German people simply are among the most anti-Trump in all of Europe. The polling is quite clear. But I think the larger issue is going to be what is in Germany's interest as the economic driver of the European Union. It's the economic colossus of the continent, and its policies will be very influential in France, in Germany, in Italy, less so in the UK, as you correctly note, with Brexit looming in several months. So I think the U.S.-German relationship has to be very carefully cultivated. And China aside, I think the issue of Russia is going to be very important in this relationship because of Germany's increasing dependence on Russia for natural gas, while it wants the U.S. to maintain a very sizable military footprint to protect it from Russia. So it's a seemingly contradictory argument, and Berlin and Washington have to sort that out, as well as all of the issues that we've discussed here over the last several minutes.
It's a fascinating topic. Thank you so much for both of you helping us to understand from the geopolitical and the political point of view how this relationship across Atlantic are likely to go on, particularly with a rising power like China. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. John Sitalidis and Klaus Laris, really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you. Be well and be safe. It is not just about geopolitics, but also economy and trade. And with respect in that direction, let's invite from Brussels, Daniel Groh, Director of the Center for European Policy Studies. Mr. Groh, what a pleasure seeing you.
Pleasure's all mine.
Well, the big trip made by the national security advisors from the United States, how do you think it's likely to have a discussion about the trade and economic aspect of this cross-Atlantic relations?
Here in Europe, many people are a bit astonished about what Trump and the Americans in general are doing, because for us, China is, of course, a big competitor, but also a big market. And here in Europe, people have difficulties understanding why one should actually try to decouple the Chinese economy from that of the United States or from Europe or the West in general. Trade is always a two-way flow, and interdependence between the two is actually a good thing, especially when you have geopolitical rivalries.
So, Mr. Groh, tell me, how do you think the topic of China is likely to be presented by the European side to your American counterparts when the national security advisors are visiting France for 3 days?
I think the tenor throughout Europe will be very similar. We are in Europe with the Americans in terms of values, human rights, democracy. There we share the same approach and the same view of the world. But when it comes to keeping relationships open, talking to your partners, and especially keeping trade open, then I think the view is very, very different. We in Europe think that more trade is better, and in the United States, some at least, and especially in the security part of the United States administration, they think that China poses such a security threat that they want to cut as much as possible the economic ties, especially in the high-tech area. And that is an area where Europe and the United States continue to have very different views.
Mr. Groh, it's not necessarily going to be 100% engagement with China. I understand the latest trend coming from Europe. But it's not so-called decoupling as the Americans are trying to do, at least this administration is trying to do with China. So what is that golden middle way for Europe? And have Europe countries here been thinking about a good golden middle way? Or probably even than that, as I asked my earlier panelist, would Europe be able to hedge between the relations that is quite tricky between China and the United States?
Yeah, Europe is, of course, in a difficult position because on the security side, it depends very much on the United States and its military. But on the economic side, things are very different. And that's why here in Europe, it's not so much that we try a third way, we try a different way in the sense that we try to decouple the security aspects from the economic aspects. On the economic side, I think Europe will remain quite open towards China and towards the rest of the world. On the security side, however, Europe has to bend somewhat more to the Americans. So it's not just one third way, it's a different way on the security side than on the economic side.
Mr. Groh, we are going to see some very intense period of time. We see the WTO is trying to find its new head. we see the global trade system now pretty much under threat with the possibility of even U.S. withdrawing from it, some suggest. And we also see COVID-19 as a global pandemic disrupting trade and economic ties, at least in short term. We also see new technologies with new global supply chains that are looking for new alternatives as a result of geopolitics. So how do you see all of these entwined to Europe? Will that opportunity be grasped vis-a-vis China?
Europe would like to grasp that opportunity. There's a feeling in Europe that it's very unfortunate the United States are not participating, but one could create a club of the willing to uphold WTO rules, which are useful even when we have new technology or disruption.
Yes.
But the impression in Europe and many other countries in the rest of the world is that the key issue is no longer signing up to commitments, but actually implementing them clearly on the ground. And that is where the major difficulty lies, not in lofty declarations, but in actual implementation on the ground. And that is where I think the relations of China with Europe and the rest of the world, outside America, will be measured.
Danny Goro, Director of the Center for European Policy Studies. What a pleasure. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us from Brussels. All the best.